Hi everyone, welcome to THT, and today we are going to talk about Kazuda Blue, and this is going to be not only a deck tech but also an in-depth guide on how to play the deck. A lot of people during Bilbao and even after ask me what deck would have played if I would have played the constructed event in Bilbao. Well, you're going to get the answer today. It would have been Kazuda Blue, specifically Kazuda Security Complex. And I'm going to get through the entire reason why that's the case. I ended up not playing the constructed portion of the event in Bilbao because I managed to make day 2 in the sealed event and decided to play sealed. But this is basically the deck I would have brought. This video is sponsored by Card Market, the best marketplace to buy and sell cards in Europe. Going into the list. As you can see, this list is quite different from the Kazuda Blue that we've been expecting to see since Legend of the Force. So basically if you want, just to give you a little bit of context on why we've decided to pick this deck. So basically, even though this deck starting points was my list that I've shown in my channel very early on in Legend of the Force, featuring all the Lothwolves and Ogdo Bogdo stuff, it's Al who mostly worked and went down the rabbit hole of Kazuda Blue and ended up with something similar to this. And then started playing as us, and we realized that the deck was very powerful, and he was also having really good result with the deck playing in other places. So we started taking the deck a lot more seriously as he was basically kicking ass with it. And what happened was that I thought I didn't really have a clear deck that I wanted to play for the event. As you know, I was mostly on Gar ECL until the ban of Thorrk. I thought after the ban of Thorrk, Gar ECL was not as well positioned, which ended up not being the case. Gar ECL is still very well positioned in the meta, by the way, but I was not so sure about Gar ECL anymore, and I didn't really have time to really learn a whole new deck that would require like a tremendous amount of learning. So I said, why not giving this deck a shot? And I started playing it and also having a lot of success with it. And I thought that the deck would be really good at surprising the meta, because even though it is another space aggro deck, it does play quite differently from other space aggro decks. So that's the reason why that's the deck I wanted to play for Bilbao. Ended up then proceeding into improving the deck and made a lot of changes, which means that this deck is as much my design as it is house design. And in the end, I didn't play the construct portion of the event, so I ended up not playing it. However, Humble, which was supposed to be playing Raided Vault, decided last minute, and when I mean last minute, I really mean like literally the nights before, on Friday night, between the sealed event and the constructed event, that he didn't want to play Ray, and that the best way to go about it was just to play Kazuda, because it was literally the easiest deck to learn overnight. Even though it does require a good knowledge of the meta to be played, if you know the meta well, it is not a difficult deck to play. If you know the meta well, which is a big if. And basically, Humble knew the meta very well, so for him it wouldn't be so difficult to learn the deck. So we tried our best on Friday night to kind of teach him the deck and all the fundamentals and try to do a bit of playtest. Even then, of course, I never advise anybody to just literally pick up a deck literally the night before an event. That is just a horrible idea, but maybe this was just a better idea than to play Raided Vault, which was really poorly positioned in the meta. In any case, he decided to play Kazuda Security Complex and ended up going 6-3 in the event, which is honestly a great performance, considering the fact that he literally had about maybe 20 games with the deck in total. So a great performance for him, and in my opinion, a proof that the deck is very good. So getting into the list. So why are we playing such a weird list? First of all, why are we not playing all the new tools from Legend of the Force like Lothwolves or Ogdo Bogdo? Well, the reason is because basically what Hal finds out is that whenever we manage to deploy Kazuda on a space unit and that space unit does not get answered, we win about 90% of our games when that happens. So what are the best way to increase our chances to make sure that happens? Well, first of all, we are playing Security Complex to protect our units, just like we were doing in the previous version. We're not playing Lothwolves and Ogdobogdo anymore because we want to maximize the amount of space units, because if you're going 50-50 on space unit and ground units, then it becomes a lot easier for your opponent to just target the space units and make sure that never deploys. And third, we are playing not 3, not 6, not 9, but 12 pieces of selective discard in order to make sure that we can get off any answers our opponent will have to Kazuda. And this is how the deck was born. Basically, all space, a bunch of selective discard to protect Kazuda. So even though this deck is undeniably an aggro deck, it almost behaves like a combo deck. And the combo is Kazuda into space unit. And then we have a very significant portion of the deck that is here just to make sure that this will happen. And I'm going to get, of course, into the details on what happens. So once again, once you have this idea that the whole point of the build is to make sure that Kazuda deploys on the space unit and stays alive. Once you understand this, all the deck makes sense, basically. So, but obviously we're going to get into the details of the different cards and what is a typical way we're playing this deck. So here's the structure on how we play this deck. And this deck basically is almost always going to play the exact same way in the first 4 turns of the game, which are the most important ones. On turn 1, we're obviously going to be playing one of our turn 1 plays, which is obviously the best one is Corporate Redemption Shuttle, because there's no turn 1 plays that can possibly kill it, at least not that I know of, not that are played in the meta. Fireball, which is also a really solid card, a 3/3 for 2 that sometimes can ambush to kill the enemy units, and then we can keep it alive, of course, with Kazuda. Not as good, but still a decent card. A 3/2 for 2 puts a lot of pressures in space, and N1 Starfighters. And then a card that you might not even remember that it exists, it is the Outer Rim Headhunter, which is a mediocre 1/3 red 1 for 2 that is from Spark of Rebellion. But it turns out that in this specific deck, this card is actually very good, because once you get your leader deployed, which is, as I said, pretty much always what this deck is trying to do, to keep the leader deployed and to keep the leader alive at all cost, then his on-attack ability becomes really powerful, allows us to exhaust any non-leader unit, which is a very powerful tool, not only to protect all units if we go in space versus space, but also to race. And as you can expect, this deck ends up in racing situations very often. So Outer Rim Headhunter, not the greatest turn 1 play, but later on in the game becomes a really, really strong card. And then obviously on the first turn of the game, depending on the matchup, we might also use Security Complex. So for example, if you're running against hand 1 green, you're going to use Security Complex to protect your turn 1 play against a Falcon or against a blue leader. Obviously, Corporate Defense Shuttle doesn't need that. We can also protect our turn 1 play by going R2D2. If you go Fireball and then R2D2, then nothing bad can happen to your Fireball, unless you're playing in someone who plays the Escort Fighter, the 4/1 Ambush. Once again, this deck does require a good knowledge of the meta to know what to use and what not to use in different situations. So that's the turn 1 play typically, is one of those 4 cards, and then sometimes we're going to shield it, and sometimes we're going to put R2 on it. The turn 2 is almost always the same as well. We're going to be trying to play a 3 drops, preferably either a Stolen 80 Hauler, or even better, a Minion Falcon. Those cards are the ideal units to deploy your Kazuda into. Basically, playing Kazuda on Stolen 80 Hauler is great, because if your opponent ever managed to beat that unit, you kind of lost the game anyways. So the when defeated effect doesn't really matter. However, the fact that you're putting this on a 5 HP unit is going to make it very difficult to kill. And also, it has 4 attack. And Minion Falcon is great because obviously you get a +1 attack bonus coming from the pilots, and then you get to add additional pilots. Obviously, the ideal scenario is you get Falcon, and then you put your Kazuda on it, and then on the same turn you put a Han Solo, and then you have a 10/10 space that is almost impossible to destroy, and that's going to kill you in just a couple of swings. The very important things to keep in mind on turn 2 is that as often as is possible, we want to have initiative going into turn 3. It's not always possible to do so, but most of the time it is. But you want to have initiative going into turn 3 because it's going to make your selective discard so much more effective. And the turn 3 is where the selective discard usually come into play. Sometimes we can play selective discard on turn 2, especially if we go like a 2 drops, then we have a selective discard that costs 1. We can go this on turn 2. But most of the time, like, we're going to play selective discard on turn 3. Sometimes we can play selective discard on turn 1, but that's only if you're playing against hand 1 and hand 1 goes resource turn 1. And then you can kind of blow him out by removing the only turn 1 play they have. And they've resourced for no reason, and you are so far ahead. But that's the only cases where I would recommend discard on turn 1. So the discard is really for the turn 3, so we're either going to be playing one of the 4 pieces of selective discard, Unmasking the Conspiracy, Jam Communication, Spark of Rebellion, and Tip the Scale. So depending on if you want to play a 3 drops or a 1 drop alongside it, we're either going to be playing Spark of Unmasking the Conspiracy. Sometimes in the matchup, you can just play Jam or Tip the Scale and know that you're going to hit. Of course, you don't always have the option. You play with what you have. And then after you play that discard, you're obviously going to remove the only answer your opponent might have for Kazuda. And then you're going to follow by either a pilot, like Han Solo, a 3 drops. Desperate Skirmisher is usually a pretty good one to play on turn 3. And then another 2 drops. Or you can also go double discard. We play 12 pieces of selective discard, so it's not unlikely by the point we reach turn 3 that you might have 2 pieces of selective discard. Usually you would want to have 2 pieces of selective discard whenever you're playing against a control deck. And whenever you play against control deck, they might have multiple answers to Kazuda, so it's nice to have multiple pieces of selective discard. And then you deploy, then you might want to use Security Complex. Very important to use Security Complex before you deploy Kazuda, if you intend to shield Kazuda, because once Security Complex doesn't work on leaders, but the trick is to put it on the unit first and then deploy into it, and then suddenly you have a giant leader unit that is shielded. There's some matchup where that's just unbeatable. And you might also use R2 as well. So it's really all about securing the Kazuda deploy and then basically just beating your opponent a couple of turns. And this is something that makes this deck very unique, and it's something that we've never seen in any other aggro decks. It's what makes this deck unique is that we are basically crafting an unbeatable Kazuda and just winning the game like this. And from our experience at Enigma, this strategy has been way more effective than just running a classic Kazuda blue or classic Kazuda red. So it might not be the best space deck in the world, but it is the best way to break Kazuda. We are pretty confident about that. Obviously, so we have a couple of racing tools. So there's cases where your opponent has no answers to Kazuda, but he's going to try to win by just racing us. After all, we're only playing a 25 HP base. Usually, our deck is very, very good at racing because we have a lot of damage that is concentrated on 1 or 2 units. So that means we are very action efficient. We are dealing a lot of damage for the actions that we have, which makes the deck really good at racing. But we still want to have a little bit of help in some matchups. So this Space Chemistry is a really good one. Adds more pressure on the board and exhausts a unit of any size is great. Auto Remade Hunter is another one that can just exhaust over and over again as long as Kazuda is on the board, which it often will be, especially against other aggro decks that don't have any means to defeat Kazuda. We obviously had Add Maneuver, which is by far the best racing card in the game in this that you could possibly play for this deck. And then after Sideboard, we're also running some Bamboozle, which is a great way to exhaust very large units and also return enemy upgrades. So those are basically our tools that we use to kind of race against anybody. We also run a couple of protection tools to protect Kazuda that are not selective discard. So among those, R2D2 obviously gives us those little bit of extra stats. It's a card that really requires a lot of finesse to be played. It requires you to understand the meta very well. Am I playing against someone who plays Vigilance? Am I playing against someone who plays Takedown? And just play this R2 at the right moment, on the right units, to make sure that you're just putting it over the breaking point. And it's so it requires a really good understanding of matchup, but when you do, it's very effective. It's also extra pressure for 0. Sometimes we play it on the ground, just to play around Power Dioxide. And obviously, it's a +2/+1 bonus if you're playing it on the Falcon. On the Falcon, the new one. Then we got the Confiscate. So Confiscate is basically an answer to Entrench. Entrench is a really big pain against us. And it is a card that sees a lot of play, especially in the most popular deck in the game, which is Han 2. That's why we run Confiscate in the main. And Confiscate is also useful in other matchups. It's also a great answer to Traitorous, which is incredibly powerful against us. So it's not a card that is useful in every matchup, but in matchup in which it's useful, it's absolutely game-breaking. And it makes it so whenever you're going from the discard, you don't have to worry. If you have a Confiscate and you know you don't have to worry about anything that is upgrade, you can play Jam Communication and know that you're not going to whiff because opponent plays an upgrade, you can just get rid of it. And then also in the sideboard, we're running Covered Strength, which is a card that is very well positioned in the current meta. Because it's good against a number of decks. It's good against Palpatine Yellow. Your opponent just pings you, thinking he's going to be able to deploy Palp the turn after and steal your units. You can heal it up and just screw him over very hard. It's really good against Cad Bane because Cad Bane is going to try to use Stark in Town. It's really good against Quinlan. It's really good against Boba Datavolt because it heals a bunch. All those, basically every deck that is going to try to kill your units in multiple instances of damage, Covered Strength is going to screw them very hard. Most of the time we want to play it for 1 because the deck does not have access to many resources, so 3 to pay for this is a lot for a deck that doesn't usually resource beyond 4. Like, we might resource up to 5, but not more than that. And spending your entire turn just to do this is a bit of a pain. So most of the time you're going to be spending only 1 resource for this. But obviously the fact that it has Smuggle is a nice little touch to the card and can really allow us to kind of resource the card a bit more efficiently. So it's a really great sideboard card. We'll talk a bit more about it as we go into the sideboard plan. Cards that I don't like, cards that we're not running. So we're not running Lothwolves because as good as a unit that it is, it doesn't help us into the game plan of trying to deploy Kazuda on the space unit. It just makes it so... Basically, the big idea of this deck is to invalidate a big portion of your opponent deck. Is to say, a big chunk of your deck doesn't actually work, doesn't actually do anything. And by playing ground units, you're basically saying, well, in fact, I'm actually giving you opportunities to make use of the cards that you have in your deck. So that's the thing. Another factor as well. So it's really what this deck is all about, right? Because all we're doing is going for those 3 turns where we're going to try to set up an invisible Kazuda, and then you're basically relying on your top deck to win the game. And because we have invalidated a big portion of the deck, a big portion of the deck doesn't matter anymore. That means you're going to have very bad top decks. And we are hoping that you're not going to get too lucky. So, yeah, Lost Wolf doesn't play into that game plan at all. Octobogdo for the exact same reason as Lost Wolf, and arguably a worse card because our turn 2 is even more important because that's the body where most likely we're going to be deploying Kazuda into. Cover the Wings is a card that we tested a lot as well. It's not terrible, but it turns out that the extra X-Wing body almost never really mattered because it didn't really push a lot of damage, so we just prefer to play cards that are a lot cheaper, that perform kind of the same job as Cover the Wings, but are a lot cheaper, like R2 or Cover the Wings. Of Covered Strengths, that actually allows surviving the key removal and also give us extra damage and are a lot cheaper. Next we got the J-Type Nubian Starship. Not a bad card. We can draw a card and then we can turn off the disadvantage to never have to discard a card. It turns out drawing a card in this deck is not very relevant, and 2 attack only is a bit underwhelming for a deck that is supposed to be super duper aggressive. And then finally Waylay. Waylay would be a good card if the meta was full of Space Sentinels, But it turns out to not be the case at all. Actually, Space Sentinels are very rarely played in this meta. There's simply just there's just don't see a lot of play right now. There's not many decks that use them. So Waylay doesn't really is not really important in the current meta. And it doesn't help protecting, and so it doesn't really do much in this meta. There's also another card, is the Mercenary Gunship, the 3/2 that neutral that your opponent can steal. This is a card that we've been playing for a while, but we just realized that the fact that your opponent can steal it for 4 resource was just too big of an inconvenience. And once again, the entire idea of this deck is to make your opponent have no plays, is to make it so we are invalidating a huge portion of the opponent deck, and then the few valid card that they have, we just discard them. And by playing a unit that basically your opponent can spend 4 resources to steal, we are basically giving them a play against us, even though otherwise they might not have anything to play. And that was just not good, and it was just very awkward units. Moving on to I just want to let you know that you can pick up Stolen 80 Holler for €6 on card markets. This is definitely one of these cards which might go up in price after rotation, so make sure you pick them up. Let's talk now about the sideboard plan for each matchup, as well as how I envision those different matchups. So first of all, we got Sabine, which I think is a very favorable matchup. Sabine does not have many plays against us because they basically have ECL. Sabine Masterpiece is pretty much the only major plays that they have against us. And it's not even that good of a play because it's very counterable just by putting a shield on your early game units. So yeah, it's a deck that doesn't have many plays against us. We can usually raise them very well. Yes, they can play Poe and then attack and destroy your upgrades the turn after, but that's usually a little bit slow, and we have plenty of ways to exhaust units as well. They might usually they like to play Confiscate after sideboard, but we have so much discard that it's usually we can discard it basically on turn 3 and make sure that doesn't happen. And we just race much faster than Sabine is able to do. Sabine basically can't really use ECL to anything useful outside of, once again, the Sabine Masterpiece. It's just a really good matchup. They're not able to race us, and they don't have many plays into us, so it's a pretty easy matchup. As far as sideboard plan is concerned, we're adding in the Bamboozle because one of the few things that can actually race us is Darksaber onto Sabine, so Bamboozle takes care of that. Tip the Scale is the card we side out because there's not many card that we can discard with it. So also Jam Communication is not great either, but we just have nothing else to side in, so we just got it. Hantu ECL, we have the exact same sideboard plan because the decks are fairly similar. However, the matchup is not as favorable. There's a couple of things that Hantu ECL is capable of doing that Sabine cannot do, and that really helps Hantu. One of those things is obviously the Poe pilots that can put up a 4/5 on turn 2. That's really, really annoying to us. We do have answers to it, but it's a really annoying card. And another thing is that they're able to play Poe 1 turn earlier using Han's ability, and that's a big deal because Poe coming out 1 turn earlier means they can destroy Kazuda 1 turn earlier, and that is a massive issue. Other than that, the matchup is pretty... And another thing as well is that in sideboard, they actually play Dissembling Fang Fighters instead of Confiscate. And Fang Fighters is a far stronger card against us than Confiscate because we can't discard it with Jam Communication, we can't discard it with Tip the Scale, and it also gives them a body that can trade with our units, which is terrible. So all those factors combined makes it so it's actually a pretty favorable matchup before sideboard. It's not very favorable as opposed to Sabine, but it still is favorable because for everything else, the dynamic against Sabine is pretty much the same. They don't have many plays against us, and we can just race them much faster. However, after sideboard, the matchup evens out a lot more because they have a lot of good sideboard, the relevant sideboard cards. One of them being the Fang Fighters. Obviously, I'm based myself on the version that the Super Racers are playing. Obviously, depending on the version that you might be facing, there might be different outcomes. Then we got the Han Green. This matchup is not favorable because Han Green has a lot of plays into us. Notably, of course, Falcon and Blue Leader. It's also a deck that is capable of killing very quickly. The pilots can be also a big problem, and even if we manage to discard the answers that they have, they might just go tech and find the answers of their resource pile. Tech is really strong against our version of Kazuda Blue because we run a lot of discard and we are planning on removing the relevant cards of the opponent, but obviously techs counter that. So there's a lot of annoying things going on. It is still, of course, very winnable matchup because we have answers to obviously both Blue Raiders and Falcons. They're not always going to find it. Sometimes they make the play of I'm gonna resource and I'm gonna play Falcon on turn 1, and then we can go Spark turn 1 and we can put them in big trouble doing this. The sideboard, we're adding the Bamboozle. It blocks Han. It taps down Han to prevent him from ramping into 7/7. It's excellent against pilots. We get rid of the Confiscate. Even though it is good against pilot, they usually don't run any other upgrade that are relevant to remove, and Bamboozle basically takes care of that anyway. So that's kind of how we play against Han Green. It is not a great matchup. Moving on, we got the Han 1 Blue, and this matchup is it's so much easier because Han Blue is mostly focused on the ground, doesn't have many anti-space, and mostly the anti-space it's going to have is going to be Entrench, which, as you know, we have very easy time dealing with because we have a lot of discard and we play the 3 copies of Confiscate in the main. So yeah, pretty much everything that we don't like is gone, which makes the matchup a lot easier. And for this matchup, we basically remove the R2s because R2 is kind of like this slot where we don't know, if you don't know what to remove, you can just get rid of R2s and it's usually okay. And obviously Bamboozle are still really good at preventing Han from ramping into 7/7 and just racing in general, basically. Moving on, we got Kira, which is a pretty balanced matchup. It's very draw dependent. Power Dark Side is obviously very powerful against us. Just hard removes are just really good, and obviously the Kira deploy into Barrage is also a very effective way to get rid of our Kazuda. Thankfully, we have loads of discard to get rid of this. So that's why we're pretty cool. Covert Strength is pretty good in this matchup. It does really good job at countering the Kira deploy because we can just heal up the unit and move some shields and putting out of range of a Barrage. And it's also really good at countering cards such as Takedown, Vigilance, all those kind of like stat-based removal, because we can just push the unit just over the edge to make sure that we put ourselves out of range. Also works against devastating gunship, that kind of thing. So basically, any removal that checks stats, basically. We're taking out the outmaneuver. Kira is sometimes will be in a position to race us because they have 33 HP and we only have 25, but that's still pretty rare, and we have, and in this case, we can just play the Skirmisher. Confiscate, so basically, if you're expecting the Kira player to play Traitorous, or Entrenched, then you don't want to side out any Confiscate. If you do, then, so depending on which version you're playing, you might take out all 3 Confiscates and keep the outmaneuver, or the opposite is add all the outmaneuver and then remove the Confiscate, depending on which version you're playing against. But this is going to be a mix of those 2 cards that you're going to be taking out, basically. Moving on, we got Thrawn. So Thrawn is a much better matchup, is a slightly better matchup than Kira, because the Thrawn deploy absolutely does nothing against us. Also, Thrawn is a value deck that is basing itself a lot on generating value of killing of us killing their units, but we're not planning to kill their units ever, so he's not really going to generate a lot of value from his cards, and he's gonna have fewer space units. He's not going to play Devastating Gunship. He's not going to have the Kira deploy into Barrage. That is really a big threat to us. So it's really a much easier matchup. They have a lot of fewer plays into us. Generally speaking, Thorn is pretty weak to space aggro. So what do we do? Obviously, it's kind of the same idea as Covert Strain, not as good as against Kira. That's why we put a Breaking. Breaking is kind of the flexible side card. When we have cards that are really bad in a matchup and we don't know what to add in, Breaking is kind of a vanilla decent card that we can always side in, and it's also might be good at getting through some of the Space Sentinel they might have after sideboard. Like we've seen some Thrawn liking to play Interdictor in their sideboard as a way to block Space Arena. Breaking can answer that too. Then we got Cat Bane. So Cat Bane is a matchup that was pretty not great, but then we made a lot of changes to the sideboard to accommodate this matchup. We knew that this deck was going to see a lot of play going into the event, so we prepared it really well, and we really managed to flip the sideboard with the matchup after sideboard. So before sideboard, it's a pretty even matchup. It's once again quite draw dependent. The early game is awful, but Cat Bane is good against everything in the early game. Double 1-drop opening plus ping plus ping is very annoying. We can shield, but then you can get rid of the shield and then ping the turn after and use the Dark Town anyway. Tons of very painful things you can do. But after the early game, then it becomes a lot easier, because then it really has to have it doesn't have many plays against us, and it's kind of the same aggro things that's going on. It's just the early game that's very, very tricky. But after sideboard, it just makes everything becomes a lot better. Favorable Delegate has been placed in sideboard solely for this matchup. Even though we do sideboard it in some other matchups, it's 90% for that matchup that it's here. And this card is amazing in this deck because it will draw us a card, whatever, but it's a 1/5 body that will absorb the Cat Bane pings and can actually kill the 3/1 and the 2/1 that he plays early on in the game. And then we can, when it's about to die, we can just turn off so we don't have to discard a card, which is great. Covert Strange is also an amazing card that will counter the pings and prevent the opponent from using Talking Town on key targets in the early stage of the game. Confiscate is useless. He plays barely any upgrades. And N1 Starfighter is not great because once it gets pinged, it becomes just an easy kill, and he doesn't even have need to use Talking Town to kill it. So it's just a low health unit. It's just really bad against Cat Bane in general. And since we're playing Favorable Delegate as a 2-drop, we can afford to side out some 2-drop without losing in consistency. Next, we got Palpatine. So Palpatine, yellow, is probably one of the best Palpatine against aggro, but it still is bad against aggro. He does have some plays against us. Notably, I think Legacy Run is very, very powerful against us, but it's still a deck that has basically no leader deploy until like a very long time. And if he doesn't draw Legacy Run, it's like a very, very tough matchup for him. And even Legacy Run, most likely he's going to have to combine it with Sneak Attack to make it work, because otherwise it might just be a little bit too late, because then you drop it on turn 4, and then on turn 5 you're kind of already dead. And obviously the Sneak Attack into Legacy Run is absolutely insane against us, but we have a lot of discards to make sure that doesn't happen. And hopefully we're able to discard this before that happens, basically. So it's a pretty favorable matchup. It's not an auto win by any means. Palpatine can have some really nasty draws, but overall I think it's a pretty good matchup for us. And we have some really good sideboard as well. Covert Strength is really great because they will try to kill your units by stacking multiple instances of pings combined with damage and stuff, and Covert Strength can just blow this out. Breaking just for extra pressure. Confiscate is not great. He's playing a couple of traders, so you might want to keep Confiscate depending on how many they're playing. And then Hand Maneuver is not great because we are very rarely in a racing situation in this matchup. Moving on, we get Hand 2 Blue Force. So the big reason why I was confident in that this deck would be well positioned in the meta is because he had a great matchup against Hand 2 Blue Force. And that's, in my opinion, the main reason to be playing this deck is that it has a great matchup against Blue Force. So why is blue for such a good matchup? Very simple, because they don't have a lot of. It's well known that false decks are kind of weak against aggro decks, and against space aggro decks, and the fact that full throw is gone is a very big deal, because now basically the hand 2 blue force decks are replacing full throw by entrench, but entrench is such an easier card to manage, because as I said, entrench is the reason we play 3 copies of confiscate. So between the 3 copies of confiscate and the 12 piece of the selective discard, hand 2 is almost gonna have no play into us, and all we have to do is basically raise them, and that's something that deck is very comfortable doing. Just add maneuver, so, and we just kill him in a couple of turns. There's still the Poe with the discount that can be tricky, but yeah, outside of this, the deck has very few play into us, and it's a very good matchup. Just breaking it for extra aggressiveness, R2 is not a particularly good card in matchup, whatever. Then we got Talzin Red. Talzin Red is a good matchup for the exact same reason it has to in a good matchup. It's also a force, mostly ground-based deck that doesn't do so well against against space. They do, of course, have a bit more removal. They got false lightnings. They have some -3/-3, does that kind of stuff. So they do have a bit more plays, but overall it's still a pretty comfortable. They have no disintegration as well, which is quite good against us, but it doesn't work on leaders, so it doesn't work on Kazuda, so it's kind of whatever. And once again, we can counter those -1 and those mathy things with Cover Strain. We're playing Bamboozle because sometimes Talzin can race us with like an upgrade on their leaders, so Bamboozle can counter this. Confiscate, not as good in this matchup. Not as good as hand 2 red, but still a pretty good matchup. Yoda Green is another very favorable matchup, or any sort of Yoda decks, to be honest. It's known Yoda Green doesn't do great against space aggro, because the main reason the Yoda Green is defending against aggro is mostly like Shirut, and obviously Shirut doesn't do anything against space decks. So once again, they're gonna have to put themselves in a racing situation. They have no leader to deploy. It's just an easy matchup. We're able to win usually before Yoda gets deployed. Leader ability is pretty much irrelevant as well. Moving on, we got Boba Data Vault. So Boba Data Vault is actually a pretty bad matchup for us. The reason is because they are mostly a space focused decks, so they are able to fight on their own arena. Generally speaking, Kazuda, especially our version of Kazuda, doesn't want to fight other space decks. They want to be their comfort zone is, I am in space, you're on the ground, and then I'm basically racing and I'm winning. They don't want to be trading in space. That's not what the deck is trying to do. So that's the first problem. The second problem is obviously 33 HP versus 25, meaning that you can very well race us. They have a lot of powerful cards against us, like Barrage, the deploy, all that stuff is very powerful. So it's not a great matchup. It's obviously not unlosable. We have a lot of good plays. We have a very good sideboard against them. Cover Strain is very useful because it's mostly damage based. Bamboozle is also a great way to counter the Bobo deployment and basically just win the race. You might be surprised to see us siding out the Confiscate. That's mostly because Bamboozle does such a better job at Confiscate. Boba is actually not super high value because the value from Boba comes a lot from its deployment. Bamboozle just does a such better job because you're exhausting the unit as well. Unmaneuver is useless because he's playing in space, so we're gonna be exhausting our own units by playing Unmaneuver. Yeah, so not a great matchup. Hard to race, but it's definitely very winnable in my opinion. Especially if our opponent doesn't play. Another problem also is that Boba Default also now a lot of them just play 3 copies of Fang Fighters in the main, which is also a big problem. But really, Boba Default sometimes have a tendency to just lose to itself because it's a deck that is not super consistent. So if your opponent doesn't manage to ramp and doesn't have great turn 1 plays, we can win like this, pretty much. Another unfavorable matchup is Velo Yellow. Velo yellow is a problem because, once again, they're fighting space versus space. And the big problem is that they have a lot of very strong plays into us, like No Good to Me Dead, Barrage, Craving Powers. All those cards are really strong against us. And so they play the control, and then once they become big enough, they can kill us extremely quickly, pretty much. So not a great matchup. Still very winnable, of course. Because sometimes we can just have a great start with a Fireball, prevent them from using Vader's ability, and then the game kind of spirals out of control. But so we can still very much win, but it's a tricky matchup. Same logic as against Boba. It's Confiscate. Bamboozle is just such a better card than Confiscate in this particular matchup, and against Pilot Leaders in general. Last but not least, we got Iden Daredevils. This matchup is almost unwinnable. I've tried so many things to try to solve this matchup, and even with all the Sideboard cards in the world, this matchup is unwinnable. The reason why soft control is not a big problem for the deck, but hard control is a big problem for the deck, is because hard control has just this critical mass of removal, which means that whenever you go discard, you can remove one of their removal, but you still have 3 more removals that can do the exact same job. And then you basically play this card for no reason. You've lost tempo by playing this card, and it didn't really achieve anything. And even if you go double discard on something, that's not even enough. And so they can just kill your stuff, take it slow, kill your stuff, and there's not much you can do about it. Basically, as I said, the big strength of the Kazuda 12 discard deck is to invalidate a large portion of your opponent's deck and then discard a few answers that they have. But against hard control, 100% of their deck is relevant against you, or very close to 100%. And the discard does not remove enough threats for you to be protected. So what do we side in? We side out the racing tools, basically, that are pretty much useless, and we try to add in some protection, more protection, favorable delegate to try to get some draws and protect against Power Dark Side, breaking in for extra aggression, but those changes don't move the needle at all, and this is still a very unfavorable matchup. Luckily enough, Iden Daredevil doesn't see a lot of play, so that's basically what we're planning on. We're planning on just trying to dodge this matchup, pretty much. There is cards that you can play in order to improve matchups, some of the Shadow Intention, that kind of stuff. But it doesn't, as I said, those cards are only useful in that matchup. They take up a lot of space in your sideboard, and they only move the needles a little bit, not enough to make it worth it. So now the question is, under which circumstances in the current meta do you think you should play this deck? So obviously I'm making this deck mostly for people who are preparing for PQs for the next few weeks, or for people who are going to be taking part in the Munich sector qualifier. And basically, if you answer yes to all those questions, in my opinion, you should strongly consider running this deck. The first question is, you have a solid knowledge of the meta, but you're not super confident in your ability as a player. So this is something we actually find out at Enigma, and we realized that Kazuda Blue was a great deck to run for many people, but for people like us in Enigma, people who play the game a lot and are very, very good players, for us, running a deck that surrounds so much into the ability from your opponent top deck, because sometimes you're going to be playing perfectly and you're going to get screwed over because your opponent just top deck the card. It's a deck that has a lot of big luck. Even though it's a very consistent deck, there's a big luck factor to consider, because no matter how much you discard, your opponent can always top deck the perfect card to win the game. And that means that sometimes running this deck, we lose against players who are much worse than us. With that being said, the other way around is very true as well. This deck will sometimes make you lose against players who are much worse than you are. However, it will also allow you to win games against players that are much better than you are, simply because they just can't do anything. because you just discarded their only answers. And even though they played perfectly, there's just nothing they could do because that's the nature of the card. So it's true in both ways. So if you have a good knowledge of the meta, because this deck does require a good knowledge of the meta to know when to play what, it's a fairly straightforward deck to play, and you're not super confident on your ability to. If you think that if you're going into a deck, like let's say you're going to be planning to play Hunt to ECL, but you only picked up the deck a couple of days ago and you're not very confident with the deck, then maybe you should shift to a deck like Kazuda, which will allow you to beat players that are much better than you are and do really well in the event. So that's the first thing I would try to figure out if I was considering playing this deck. The second thing I would figure out is obviously the meta game. Basically, if you're on a ground-based dominated meta, I think this deck is excellent. If you're in a space deck dominated meta, this deck is terrible. So right now, I'm expecting this deck to be quite good going into Munich, because I think the meta, there's going to be a lot more Talzin, which is a ground-based deck. There's going to be a lot more Throne, which is probably the easiest control deck you could possibly face with the deck. There's going to be a lot of Hunt to ECL, which is, even though it's not as good as Sabine, it still is a decent matchup. And there's also going to be a lot of... So right now, I feel like we are in a ground-dominated meta, but what is true for my expectations might not be true everywhere you are, and every area has this local meta. So if you're in a ground-dominated meta, I feel like it's a great deck. Third, you get tired easily and want to have short games. A big argument for many people whenever they choose their deck for a big tournaments is to play a deck that actually does play really fast, play really quick games, and able to get, so you have a lot of time between different rounds to recover every time. Kazuda Blue is a deck that, even if you don't have a lot of experience with the deck, you can afford to take your time and play very slowly. And the reason why you do this is because games are just extremely short. You either win very quickly or lose very quickly with this deck. So it allows you to take, so you are able to take your time playing your deck, which is very important, especially if you're not too comfortable with the deck. I think one of the big reasons why Humble managed to do so well with the deck despite having so little experience is because he was taking his time making every plays. And he could afford to, because games are just incredibly short. So those are like the fourth arguments is if you have a time to study but not a lot of time to practice. So Kazuda is a deck, I mean, our version of Kazuda requires a good knowledge of the meta, so you have to study the meta, which means watching my videos, looking at the stats on Subase or on Competitive Hub, and basically trying to figure out what are the plays that each deck has against you. We'll talk about it at the end. I have made a special documents where I've mapped out every single threat in every single matchup, and you can also take inspiration from these documents and study it. So this deck does require some study to be played at its best. However, it does not require a lot of time to practice, because as I said, once you have a good knowledge of the meta, you usually know what to do. You only have to worry about 4 or 5 turns, and once again, you can take your time whenever you're playing. You can really take your time. So I do not advise, obviously, to play no game. You should still play maybe at least 50 games with the deck to figure it out. But once you have those 50 games, all you need to have is a good knowledge of the metas, which means that you can pick up this deck and play it at the maximum of its efficiency without a tremendous knowledge, without having a ton of practice on it, which I think is great for many people who don't necessarily have the time to play the game, but have time to study the game. So, of course, we get into the next question is, when should you not play this deck? And the answer is pretty, if you are confident in your ability to win games against most opponents while playing your favorite deck. If you already have your favorite deck that is well positioned in the meta, that you're very comfortable with, and you are confident in your ability to beat most players using this deck, then obviously you shouldn't be playing Kazuda, you should probably play your pet deck instead. That goes without saying. Second, if you're in a very space-dominant meta, or very hard, if the meta is full of space decks and hard control, Kazuda is not the best choice. What I mean by space is basically Boba Data Vaults, full of Boba Data Vaults, full of Vader Yellow, all that stuff. Then choosing this deck is not ideal. And then first is you don't have great knowledge of the meta. You don't know much of the meta. You don't know what card people are playing. Kazuda this card deck requires a knowledge of what your opponent might have that is far greater than any other deck I've ever played. This is where the skill of the deck comes from. So if you don't have a great knowledge of the meta, I strongly advise not picking up this deck. So yeah, here it is. I'm just gonna go back to so I'm just gonna very quickly talk about the documents that I've put together. This document basically maps out in the first 6 turns of the game what are the most likely threats that you might be facing in the different matchups. This document has not been updated with the current meta, so I encourage you to take a copy of this and then add up to it and update the document with the current meta. And this will help you map out the different things you need to play around, and it will help you play the deck better. So this document will be, it's a Google Sheet, and it's going to be in the description below. So coming back to the list, so this is obviously a pretty obnoxious deck to play against. It is a little bit rage-inducing because it's all about aggressing the opponent and attacking the opponent and preventing your opponent from having plays against you. It's a kind of playstyle that might appeal to you. It's a very unique deck. It's a very unique way to play the game, and it's a very innovative deck in my opinion, because it is not your standard space aggro. It is almost a combo oriented aggro deck, which is very interesting because it's all about making sure something specific in the game happen and then protecting that thing. So in my opinion, it's a very interesting deck, and if you're interested in a play style, and it's also a deck that not many people know to play against, which is also one of the big reasons why I wanted to pick it up for Bilbao, is because I was pretty confident that people were not expecting us to play this. A very common thing that happens whenever people are playing against this deck is that whenever it comes into the play of Kazuda and people are holding an Entrench in hand, they will most likely wait for you to deploy Kazuda on the space unit and then play the Entrench on that unit. But against us, that's a wrong play, because then we can just go discard turn 1, remove that Entrench before it ever gets played. So that's a good example. So yeah, and it's the kind of thing that the fact that people are not expecting this can really give you a big edge. You might argue that, oh yeah, now you published a video on your YouTube, everybody knows about it. I would not, I think people overestimate. There's not that many people watching my videos. So, take that with a grain of salt, obviously. So, thank you so much for following this video. I hope this was useful to you, and I'll see you next time.